Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Glenn Geher. He is professor of psychology at the State University of New York at New Paltz, where he has been awarded SUNY Chancellor Awards for excellence for both teaching and research. In addition to teaching various courses and directing the new Paltz Evolutionary Psychology Lab, Dr. Geher serves as a founding director of the campus's Evolutionary Studies program. He is also credited as the founder of the NorthEastern Evolutionary Psychology Society, and he has also published several books, including Evolutionary Psychology 101, Mating Intelligence Unleashed, the role of the mind in sex, dating, and love, and straightforward statistics. He also has a Psychology Today blog called Darwin Subterranean World, Evolution, Mind, and Mating Intelligence, where he addresses various topics related to the human condition. So today we're gonna basically talk about human mating, human intelligence, and also toward the end of the interview about the PsychTable, which I think is a very exciting project. So Dr. Geher, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
You got it, Ricardo. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let's start off with human mating. I've already asked this question to several people because I've been having quite a number of evolutionary psychologists on the show. But when we're thinking about human mating, where should we start from? From sexual selection and Darwin, from parental investment theory, or from where exactly?
Well, as a Darwinian or as an evolutionist, I think we definitely have to go back quite a ways. And I think that the Darwinian perspective allows us a large framework for thinking about mating from an evolutionary perspective. To step way back, we can think about what an organism is from an evolutionary perspective. And organisms, Richard Dawkins used the term survival machine to describe any organism, and I'd say a slight modification I would make to that, and I do believe he would agree, is we're actually reproducing machines, we're replicating machines, and any adaptation that facilitates replication will, by definition, be more likely to exist into the future compared with alternative adaptation. So that's like the very short way that we think about behavior in terms of natural selection. Mating is a very important class of behaviors because mating behaviors are the behaviors that directly bear on reproduction. And so from that perspective, any and all mating relevant behaviors can be understood as having been under intensive selective pressures from an evolutionary perspective. So we can really understand the entirety of human mating by using an evolutionary perspective. So the specific question you asked is kind of within this evolutionary framework, where's the best place to start? You talked about sexual selection. I think that's a very reasonable place to start. Sexual selection essentially is, it's a twofold idea, but it's the idea that organisms evolve characteristics because those characteristics benefit being attracted or being attractive to other mates. So males are larger than females. Females tend to prefer relatively large males. And so that preference is probably one factor that has over evolutionary time created males to be relatively larger, leading to what we call sexual dimorphism in the human body. So that sexual selection definitely has had a large role in everything about mating. And I would say the other thing that you raised, which I think is also foundational, is what we call parental investment theory. So Robert Trivers, probably one of the most significant evolutionary thinkers since Darwin himself, when that guy was in his 20s. I think he was like your age, Ricardo. He was a kid. In the early 1970s, he published this paper on parental investment, which changed everything. It was just this incredibly powerful idea that is pretty much saying that everything about mating behavior in any species only makes sense in terms of the required parental investment needed for that species to lead to viable offspring. So if there's very low parental investment needed, such as what we see in many species of salmon, you tend to see what we might call short-term mating strategies and approaches. So salmon don't mate for life. They don't get married. They don't look for long-term characteristics in partners. They just look for bright red, fast other salmon of the opposite sex, because there's very little. They die right after they have sex, so they don't even have time to pursue a long-term kind of mating strategy. Lots of other species have offspring that require a great deal of parental effort. Emperor penguins are a classic example. Lots of bird species, by the way, exemplify this. Emperor penguins have one offspring per season. It's a huge investment of time and energy in everything that the adults do during the courtship and mating process is just look after that one fertilized egg. So it's very parallel to humans in a lot of ways. And there you tend to see pair bonding. So and it's amazingly simple. So one thing I love about Trivers and about some of the great ideas in evolution is these are not complicated ideas. It's a simple idea. If parenting costs a lot in a species, you're going to see long-term mating strategies. And if parenting is not needed in a species, you're going to see short-term mating strategies. People like David Buss and others over the last several decades have taken that simple idea and said, wait a minute, we can really understand so much in human mating and in particular sex differences in mating behaviors in humans from this perspective, because within our species we have a great asymmetry in required parental investment. Females are necessarily going to have to invest an awful lot of time and energy and risk just to successfully reproduce once, and males simply have to sort of have one copulatory act. So that's an enormous asymmetry, which should, from an evolutionary perspective, lead to major behavioral asymmetries and strategic asymmetries in mating, and all the research shows that's exactly what we see.
Mm-hmm. But isn't it also the case that in our species, particularly because human infants have very long periods of dependency, that perhaps in comparison with other species, males also have to invest a bit more? I mean, when compared with males of other species, of course.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, there's a lot of behavioral flexibility in humans in terms of all kinds of things, and and that all interacts with culture. So within a culture, we have a ton of behavioral flexibility, and then across cultures, we see lots of behavioral differentiation. So I think that you're right to say that it's not a simple, like there's some species where it's a simple rule. In deer, for instance, so I live in the northeastern United States, and the mother deer hangs out with other females and they have offspring, and you see the buck rarely, and the buck is always alone, and he doesn't, their deer will walk in a day or two of their life, so they're very advanced or precocial as a species. They don't need dad, right? So dad kind of hangs out to the side, and you don't see a lot of flexibility in that. In humans, you see a lot of different things going on. We have much more altricial offspring than deer and a lot of other mammals. And so is there a role for males in the parenting domain? Absolutely. And I think that what we see in a lot of European cultures and a lot of cultures in North America, actually throughout many parts of the world, you tend to see fathers playing a major role in parenting. But with that said, I will say that when you look back at what likely were ancestral parenting styles in humans, you actually see something pretty different from what we see in a lot of the modernized world. So an example I'll give pertains to a book by Sarah Hrdy. Sarah Hrdy, super renowned, I think she might go by an anthropologist. She's pretty much a primatologist who's studied humans as well. She wrote this book called Mothers and Others. And what she essentially makes the case of is when you look at nomadic groups across the world, whether you're talking about South America, the Pacific Islands, or Africa, you tend to see parenting is done by mothers and others. And by that, she really means other females, related females, sisters, aunts, maternal grandmother is a big player in parenting in these kinds of environments. Also, female friends that have offspring about the same age that are part of the same tribe, and the adults have long-standing ties and connections. It's kind of a built-in daycare, and that is the modal or the statistically most common parenting system we see in what we would call pre-Westernized human groups. So let me just, as a disclaimer, I'm a devoted father. I've got 2 kids. My daughter goes to college. I'm driving her old 2004 Sentra because I wanted her to have a better car in college. So believe me, I think fathers have an important role in parenting, and that's absolutely true. But at the same time, I do think that the inclusion of fathers in the proportions that we find in societies like ours doesn't really match a lot of our the conditions that we evolved to exist in.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to human mating, isn't it also the case that another aspect that we have to take into consideration is intersexual and intrasexual competition when it comes to acquiring mates and enhancing our mate value?
Yeah, so there's multiple kinds of sexual-based selection pressures. And so the one that we refer to as intrasexual, intra means within, so that's kind of like fighting within the same sex. So males fighting at a bar over a woman on a Saturday night, that's intrasexual competition. Males behaving in ways or using kind of strategic approaches, such as like insulting a guy's physical prowess, insulting a guy's ability to get money, insulting a guy's intelligence or loyalty. There are so many things that men will do to bring other men down, and it's really not nice, and it's an unfortunate reality of the social world. But when you step back, those nasty behaviors evolved because males that effectively used those strategies were more likely to secure mates and reproduce. And women do the same thing. My friend Marianne Fisher recently published a whole handbook with Oxford on competition in women. It might be 500-600 pages, this book, and every single chapter is about subtle, underhanded, yet empirically discernible things that women will do that are really just undercutting other women in efforts to secure sort of the highest quality males. So those things absolutely happen. So that's intrasexual selection or intrasexual competition, whereas intersexual selection is things that individuals do to become attracted to potential mates, and processes that we have that we find, like what do we find attractive in potential mates, and what do we do to make ourselves attractive to potential mates. This is not a small aspect of the human condition. If you go to any drugstore, I haven't been to Portugal yet, but I'm guessing that they sell lots of cosmetic products. And the entire, this is a bold statement, I'll say this, just about the entire cosmetic industry, the lion's share of it is about making women look as if they are more likely to be in the fertile window of life. So when you look at hair color product, you see a lot of dark brown, red, blonde. You don't see a lot of white and gray. When you see things about skin products, you see things to reduce wrinkles, but you don't see a lot of things that are advertised as this will give you a lot of wrinkles. The We take steps to try to secure mates given the evolved psychology of potential mates. And in the case of women, that means trying to appear in the fertile window, because males evolved to be attracted to certain characteristics of women who were in that fertile window, simply because males who had preferences for women that were outside that fertile window were less likely to reproduce with fertile women, were less likely to have their mating preferences passed down across generations. So yeah, I think everything you're talking about, these are definitely all the factors that come into play.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to mate preferences, I mean, there are, I guess, general mate preferences for both sexes, and they differ quite a bit. But don't we also have to break them down for both sexes in terms of people preferring short-term or long-term mating strategies? Because, I mean, if we analyze them according to short-term or long-term strategies, then the preferences differ a little bit, even within the same sex, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, someone, I think my friend Dave Schmidt, who's at Brunel University, he posted, it might have been on Twitter, I'm not exactly sure, but it was a very simple 2 by 2 box, which kind of talks about males and females and short-term and long-term strategies. And it's categorical, so it kind of glosses over and simplifies some of the reality, but it's useful to think about. So we can think of a general male strategy and a general female strategy. Maybe a general female strategy, since they have such high parental investment, is to seek long-term mates. Maybe a general male strategy, because they have such low parental investment, is to be sexually opportunistic and to seek many partners. But on top of those two categories, then kind of on the side we have you can pursue short-term mating approaches versus long-term mating approaches. Whether you pursue a short-term or a long-term mating approach seems to partly be dispositional. Some people seem to have traits that push them toward either long or short-term mating approaches.
And those traits, would they be personality traits?
Yeah, exactly. A classic one is what's called sociosexuality. It seems to have a pretty strong, it's pretty reliably measured, like how you score at one time seems to be related to how you score at another time. The different items on the scales of sociosexuality are strongly statistically interrelated, and people who score very high on that they're short-term strategists. That's just their general approach to mating. People who score very low on that tend to be long-term strategists. And there's a normal distribution on that for males and for females. So while males on average tend to score higher on sociosexuality, there's tons of variability within males and there's tons of variability within females. So I think that the point you're making is an absolutely critical one. While evolutionary psychology is famous for talking about sort of a general male strategy and a general female strategy, that's not the entire story by a long shot. And there's definitely short-term and long-term strategies that are utilized by members of both sexes, depending on their traits, but also depending on ecological conditions. Under certain ecological conditions, people tend to pursue short-term strategies in all life domains. So if you are living in very harsh environmental conditions, everything in your world is kind of showing you that life is short. And if all the signals in your world, such as if the average lifespan of males in your community is in the 40s or 50s, that's a signal that life is short. And if life is short, evolution will select earlier and kind of more of a shotgun approach to reproduction. And so in harsh environmental conditions, we tend to see tendencies towards short-term strategies, not necessarily because those people are like that, but because all people under those conditions would be engaging in more adaptive behavior by pursuing that kind of strategy. So whether people pursue short-term or long-term mating is an interaction of some kind of traits that people have that come about by a variety of sources, as well as prevailing ecological conditions.
Mm-hmm. And that's what we call life history theory, right? And people selecting between a fast-paced or a slow-paced life history, right?
Yes, absolutely. And this idea of life history strategy, and that wording, I think, has been a really powerful concept that's come out of the evolutionary psychological literature. It's very powerful because it's kind of like an uber bigger idea that kind of a lot of littler ideas can sort of fit in. And the other good thing I like about life history strategy is that it really it pertains to people from all different kinds of backgrounds. So a short summary of life history strategy. This is an idea that I think it was developed initially by Ed Wilson in the 1960s, biologist, talking about differences between species. Some species are slow life history strategists. They have very few offspring. They have few predators. They live in stable kinds of conditions. They can expect a long life. If you can expect a long life, then the ideal or optimal approach to life is to put a lot of time and energy into a small number of offspring who will then be very successful and will be very likely to reproduce themselves. Some species live in very harsh environmental conditions, and when you see species that live in really harsh environmental conditions, such as rabbits in the Northeast, in the Northeastern United States, where I live right now, we had about 2 weeks straight of negative temperatures. It was fierce. It was icy. The university was closed for about 2 or 3 days. We've not seen a lot of that since I've been here. The rabbits are having a really hard time. We have rabbits all over our yard, all over the woods, and during this season is very, very difficult for them. When spring emerges, rabbits are famous for they get out there and they just start mating like crazy. That's a short term or a fast life history strategy that matches existing in those kinds of ecological conditions. Evolutionary psychologists, particularly I'm thinking of A.J. Figueredo at the University of Arizona, but others as well, have applied this idea to humans, saying that while humans are generally a slow life history strategist kind of species, there's lots of variability in the kinds of environments that people grow up in. Some of us are fortunate to grow up in relatively stable environments, and some of us come from relatively unstable environments. Unstable environments, by the way, we're not necessarily talking just about an inner city with a lot of crime kind of environment. That could be one example of an unstable environment, but there's so many other kinds of unstable environments. Having a parent leave the household, having a lot of fighting in the household, having a family member with mental health problems, having a traumatic experience within the familial upbringing. There are so many things that can happen. Life is hard, as we all know, that can lead to harsh conditions across the socioeconomic spectrum. So I think that's why this is a really powerful framework that can be used to understand people in a very general sense.
Mm-hmm. So we really have to take into account several different factors here, and perhaps they interact with one another, because on the one hand we have personality traits and they vary a lot inter-individually, right, between people, and at least part of them is innate. And we also have some sort of mental algorithms that all people share, that when they are exposed to certain environmental cues, they tend to trigger a specific life history strategy, right? And both of those things interact with one another when it comes to making certain decisions and choices, right?
Absolutely. That's a very good way to summarize it.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about mating intelligence, because I guess that this is a very interesting topic. You, Geoffrey Miller, and others, I guess, proposed mating intelligence as another domain of intelligence, and I guess that, at least as far as I understand it, separate from general intelligence or IQ. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to summarize the idea. So the idea of mating intelligence came about largely, it was an idea I had from, I'm going to say, over 10 years ago. In my own graduate work, I worked at the University of New Hampshire with Jack Mayer. Jack Mayer is one of the founders of the concept of emotional intelligence. And that idea has just sort of, gone enormous in the minds of researchers and in the minds of lay people, and has been a very powerful and useful concept. It's a little bit controversial, and the controversy, I'd say, the main controversy on emotional intelligence is the question of whether the world of psychological research needed this concept. Was this something new? Was there value added? Was the research done within the auspices of emotional intelligence different than the research that was done under the auspices of emotion research, emotion related to cognition, things that were already in place? So on one hand, I'd say there was a little bit of controversy, but on the other hand, there was such excitement for this idea that it led to so many positive research outcomes and many applied outcomes. People in the business world like this idea. Just yesterday, a friend of mine in the business world asked me for a measure of emotional intelligence that he'd be able to give to his employees. And so it's almost like whether this really was an empirically novel idea or not, in some ways kind of didn't matter. It was an idea that captured the imaginations and of people and made people excited and made people start thinking about this concept and this research finding. I'd say in some sense, when we developed mating intelligence, it was kind of similar. I knew right away that the main criticism was going to be parallel to what we saw with emotional intelligence. Is this different? Is this value added? Is this something new? Is this something we can empirically measure? So these are some of the issues from a scientific perspective that sort of surrounded the launching of this idea. But, me and Geoffrey Miller, we co-edited a book that came out in 2008, I think it was. We had lots of great scholars from the field of evolution and behavior and personality writing chapters for this. And we essentially encouraged them to say, what do you think what do you think mating intelligence is? How does this, we asked AJ Figueredo, how does this relate to life history strategy? We asked Dan Nettle, how does this relate to the big 5 personality traits? We asked David Buss to write the foreword. What do you think of this idea? How does it relate to mating psychology in general? And from there, there's been lots of research in lots of different directions connecting the concepts of mating and intelligence. I will say that I think the world still is looking for a really strong and valid measure of mating intelligence as a distinct concept. The closest that we came to was at this point, and I know that there's improvements that are coming out from other labs, with Scott Barry Kaufman, who is a collaborator of mine. We created a simple self-report measure. How much do you tend to have these attributes? And the attributes were like cognitive processes that would be adaptive in a mating context. And we actually found the scale was reasonably reliable and predicted various kinds of mating relevant outcomes. There was a study that we published just a couple of years ago where we looked at that scale relative to various other dimensions, and we haven't really found that it's strongly related to general intelligence. I do think that the concept is still in need of better measures and more advanced research to make that case that it's empirically unrelated to general intelligence. But our preliminary research seems to suggest that it may actually be a unique reliable, stable set of attributes that predicts mating relevant outcomes.
Hmm. Okay, so it's not yet proven that it varies independently from general intelligence. Is
I
that
think
right?
that, yeah, I think that research still needs to be done. Needs to be done better. And I do know that Marianne Fisher at St. Mary's University and her students have been working really hard on an improved measure. And so, I think I don't know if you've talked with Marianne yet, but she would be a great person to talk about a lot of these ideas and about that particular research in particular. I will say that we did a study where we showed that um, our measure of mating intelligence was unrelated to the big five personality traits and was independently predictive of a measure of mating success. So we did find some what we would call incremental validity for the measure and for the construct. But I do think more research is necessary.
Yes, because that generally is one of the main criticisms that come from scientists in the field when people put forth proposals or hypotheses to classify other types of intelligence, like Daniel Goleman did with emotional intelligence, and other people, even like Howard Gardner, who proposed
Mm-hmm.
multiple intelligences and things like that. But really, over the years, for example, with emotional intelligence, people have not really been able to separate it from or to make it very independently from measurements related to IQ, right?
Yeah, regarding emotional intelligence, there's a paper that Jack Mayer and Peter Salovey and some others put out in 1999, published in the journal Intelligence. And I remember I thought this was a very clever way for them to deal with that issue. They essentially found that with their ability-based measure of emotional intelligence, the correlation between scores on that measure and scores on a measure of general intelligence were positive and moderate. I'm going to say statistically, if you're aware of stats, it might have been in the zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3 kind of range. And they took that. I remember it was an interesting way to think about it. They said, okay, well, this is good. On one hand, it should be related to general intelligence because general intelligence is a ubiquitous aspect of human psychology. But on the other hand, the correlation was not so strong as to say that these were completely redundant with with one another. So I feel like there's a lot of nuances in sort of how to think about the statistics regarding that kind of question.
Okay, so we've already talked about here about personality and about life history theory. So when it comes to human mating, I remember that in your book, Mating Intelligence Unleashed, at a certain point there, you and I think that it's Scott Barry Kaufman, right, that co-authored the book with you. You talk about attachment theory and attachment style. So, is that another factor that we have to consider when trying to understand how people come about with their mating strategies?
Sure. Yeah. So I think attachment style is another one of the big personality constructs or ideas that has been shown to be very relevant to how people engage in mating relevant contexts. One of the issues in this research field is a little bit of the issue of kind of construct redundancy. So it's a little bit like when AJ Figueredo wrote about life history strategy as it relates to mating intelligence. He talked about how life history strategy relates to attachment style, for instance. And there's a lot of research showing the relationship between the basic personality traits of what we call the big five personality traits of extroversion, emotional stability, agreeableness, open-mindedness, conscientiousness. These also have relationships with attachment style. So it's we kind of need to keep in mind that there is what we call at least some empirical overlap with these constructs as they relate to one another. But with that said, attachment style is a pretty strong has a pretty strong research history unto itself. It goes all the way back to mother-infant research conducted by people like Mary Ainsworth years ago, written about famously by John Bowlby years ago. And at some point in the 1980s, researchers who were doing human social relationship research, like adult research, said, wait a minute, the attachment styles that we see in little babies with their moms, some are securely attached to their moms, some seem to be insecurely attached to their moms. Those same kind of styles seem to characterize how people are in intimate relationships. Some people are very secure in their relationships. They're not worried that the partner's cheating. They're not worried that the partner's not giving them enough attention. And some people are very insecure in their relationships. And insecurity can come in various ways. It can be like always checking on the partner. Constant texting is what the kids might be doing nowadays. Are you there? Who are you with? What are you doing right now? 10 minutes later, what are you doing right now? Kind of thing. So that's a very insecure kind of attachment style that clearly has relationship relevant outcomes. We also see what's called the avoidant style, and this seems to emerge from people that really weren't given much attention when they were younger, weren't expecting much attention, and find it really hard to get close to others. And so that's another style too. It's almost like two magnets that have the same polarity and that can't quite connect. And these attachment styles, can definitely be traced back to our evolutionary roots. In fact, Bowlby was very much rooted in evolutionary thinking when he developed the idea of attachment style. And B, these are also attributes of people that have very substantial implications for behavior in the domain of mating.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to attachment styles, they derive both from personality traits, and perhaps each of them has a specific aggregate of personality traits. Like, for example, if I'm more or less conscientious, if I'm more or less extroverted, more or less neurotic or open to experience, and so on. But on the other hand, the second factor is the way we attach to our mothers during our development. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Most people that talk about this stuff will talk about it's primarily those kind of early interactions that seem to shape this. We did have, there was a speaker, Lauren Bader, who came and spoke on our campus just last week about attachment style. And she made the case for temperament. At least in her research, very early temperament, which is kind of like personality of like infants as they're just a couple of days old. Are they very surgent, which corresponds kind of to extroversion or not? And she said that was actually pretty related to their attachment-related behaviors when they were about a year old. So there does seem to be, even with attachment style, an interaction of some kind of traits that seem to have some heritable component along with the kind of experiences that an infant has early on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so the last topic of the interview would be the PsychTable, because I've read one of the articles that you published on your Psychology Today blog, and you referred to that. I think it was published last September, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds right.
But could you tell us about that? And I think it was first proposed by Dan Glass, right?
Yes. Dan Glass and his collaborator, I'm going to botch his name, Nirubon. Pretty sure that's his name. So these guys, young guys, I think they might have been 25, 26 when they came up with this idea. And it was a really sharp idea that if you're like me and you're kind of living in the world of evolutionary psychology 24/7, it was one of these ideas that I heard it and a lot of other, professionals heard it and was like, there's nothing wrong with this idea that we can think of at all. And so the basic idea is this. And it relates totally to a lot of this conversation. What are the adaptations? What are the evolved psychological adaptations that characterize humans? And how are they related to one another? Is secure attachment style the same as slow life history strategy? Are these concepts related? Is there evidence that these things are actually evolved adaptations that do facilitate survival and or reproduction, which is what an adaptation is, as just an example? So the big idea that these guys came up with was essentially this. Let's make something like what they have in chemistry. So in chemistry, they have the periodic table of elements. It has each basic element. It has the defining features of each. They're organized in a way that there's ones that are similar in terms of certain characteristics, are thought of as a sort of a class or a subclass of elements. Why not think about that with human evolved psychological adaptations? And these days, because of where we are in terms of technology, there are certain technologies available to us now that would not have been, that, wouldn't have allowed us to do this maybe 20 years ago. So the big idea here is to make something that can really be publicly policed in a sense. So the idea is there's a website, it's PsychTable.org. Right now it's kind of in its infancy, and there's a push to really advance the infrastructure. But the idea is that anyone in the world can propose a psychological adaptation. Like, you could go there, Ricardo, and you could say, I think life history strategy ought to be up there. And so you would fill out the form and you would put citations to scientific research, right? So if it doesn't have that, it's just going to get deleted because this is really science-based. So citations to scientific research. The people who oversee the table are going to look at these and figure out, is this good evidence? Is it not good evidence? What kind of evidence is this? Is this biological evidence? Is it behavioral evidence? Is it genetic evidence? And start to build a periodic table of all the human evolved psychological adaptations, including all the scientific citations that can be found in this public manner, almost like a wiki page. And it'll correct itself if there's people out there that know of scientific research that that conflict with some of the stuff up there. Instead of having some big public argument, it'll be done in the auspices of putting together this shared project with a shared goal of helping us advance our understanding of who we are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to get this straight, when we're talking about adaptation here, is it simply something that during our evolutionary history allowed for us to survive and reproduce and increased our fitness in general? Or are there any other factors that we have to take into account when we are to deciding that something that operates, in this case in our minds, is really an adaptation?
That's a great question. So the question is, how do we define, what are the attributes? At what point do we say, yep, that's an adaptation? The model that is being used to help oversee that question for PsychTable is largely rooted in the work of Dave Schmidt and June Pilcher. They came up with an article published in Psychological Science where they asked exactly that question. How do we know an adaptation when we see it? And what kind of evidence do we need as a scientific community so that we can be sure, yes, that exactly is a Darwinian adaptation? The specific example in their article they use has to do with pregnancy sickness. Pregnancy sickness, documented in detail by a then graduate student, Margie Prophet, in the early 1990s, as a doctoral student of Lita Cosmanis and John Tooby, took the idea of pregnancy sickness and said, this seems like a behavioral adaptation. Women get sick when they're pregnant at a particular time in response to particular foods. And then she started asking this question, can we see evidence for this across cultures? Does it happen at a particular part in the pregnancy? Is it in response to foods that actually might have low-level toxins that can be processed by adults but cannot be processed by younger children and babies in utero? And she put together this expose of pregnancy sickness as an adaptation. And she collected data from, I think they documented maybe 8 different kinds of data. There was genetic related data, there was cross-cultural data, there was comparative or cross-species data, all these different kinds of data. And then no one that it's funny, a lot of things are controversial in evolutionary psychology, but no one questions Margie Prophet's work. And in fact, when she was in her 20s and published that, medical science around the world on that issue changed immediately. It was one of those, because she had such a strong understanding of evolution and natural selection thinking, she was able to come up with some framework for understanding pregnancy sickness in a bigger picture way that had not been documented or really fully understood by medical practitioners prior to that point. So the PsychTable, if you look at the PsychTable materials, it actually will reference that article and use that article as an example of this is what we're talking about. You know, we're talking about you need to provide evidence that it is what's called design specificity. It has to be a specific kind of design that's independent of other features. It has to clearly lead to outcomes that lead to survival and or reproduction. These are sometimes very hard things to document. If you can document these attributes as being particularly effective in nomadic societies, which mirror in many ways our ancestral conditions, this is another feature that's useful. So there's several different ways to approach that question of do we have an adaptation on our hands.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting, and there are 2 topics there which I would really love to explore a little bit more here. The first one is, so at a certain point you referred to how to classify something as an adaptation, and even when we work in general in evolutionary psychology, I mean, one of the big criticisms that come from certain critics of evolutionary psychology is that they tend to think about it as operating in isolation. But I guess that's not really true, because there are a lot of ways in which evolutionary psychology is really interdisciplinary and gathers a lot of evidence from several different fields to really establish that a mental mechanism is really real and really operates in our mind and has an evolutionary / biological basis to it, correct?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the interdisciplinary aspect of evolutionary psychology. On that point, some of my students and myself about 7 to 8 years ago became really interested in the question of whether evolutionary psychology truly is a more interdisciplinary discipline compared with other areas within psychology. And we actually conducted 2 studies on that topic. One, we looked at evolutionary psychology journals, and what we found was that compared to other journals in psychology, the authors of those articles were much more likely to come from disciplines outside of psychology. We were more likely to have authors who were in biology departments or in anthropology departments or in philosophy departments, for instance. And in a second study, we looked at the citations or the references in papers that were published in evolutionary psychology journals compared with mainstream psychology journals, and found that evolutionary psychologists are much more likely to draw on literature from outside of traditional psychology. So I think that I think that the degree to which life is interdisciplinary, I think that's a really good thing about the field of evolutionary psych.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the other point that I would like to explore is again related to how we determine something as an adaptation, because I mean, another one of the criticisms that is really old and that people put forth against sociobiology and evolutionary psychology from its very inception, let's say, is the fact that they tend to think that evolutionary psychologists have an approach of thinking about the human mind as adaptations all the way down. But I mean,
Right.
that's not correct, right? Because there are things that are byproducts of adaptations, others that are exaptations, others that are probably the result of simply genetic drift or something like that. And evolutionary psychologists from the very beginning acknowledge that, right?
I think that phrase you use, adaptations all the way down, is perfect. I think that's there are certain conceptions of evolutionary psychology that are out there that are not necessarily accurate. In fact, in Evolutionary Psychology 101, which is a textbook I wrote on this topic, the very first chapter is all about the multiple forces of evolution. So evolution is the big general process. Natural selection is a process that facilitates evolutionary change. Sexual selection does that as well. Cultural selection can do that as well. Genetic drift can do that as well. And a lot of things that we see as typifying species evolve not because they have adaptive value, but because they're byproducts of other things that do have adaptive value. And a lot of times, evolutionary psychology research actually will sort of explore that question. You know, like there's a lot of research on music from an evolutionary perspective. Is music adaptive unto itself? Did it evolve as an adaptation? Or is music a byproduct of the fact that we have a brain that's designed to do all kinds of other stuff, and music seems to be something that emerges not as an adaptation in and of itself, but as a byproduct of the fact that we have language, we have rhythm, we have a sense of social coordination, and music kind of comes out of that. There's people that, you know, within the field of evolutionary psychology will say, based on the research they're aware of, music's not an adaptation, that it's a byproduct. And there's people making the argument the other way. So I'd say it's good, healthy science with a lot of debate within the field. When you go to an evolutionary psychology conference, what you find first, as an evolutionary psychologist, the first conference I ever went to like that in 2006, Human Behavior and Evolution Society in Philadelphia, I couldn't believe that I was surrounded by hundreds of people who understood what I was talking about. I didn't have to like argue. You know, sometimes if I'm talking to someone outside the field, they don't understand the premises, and then when they do understand them, they kind of understand them incorrectly and sort of think it's somehow some political conspiracy, which it's not, by the way. But when I went to that conference, and when I go to other evolutionary psychology conferences, everyone's on the same page in terms of the basic ideas. We are products of evolution, and our minds evolved as such, and behavior is part of the natural world. That's it. That's the basics of evolutionary psychology. At an evolutionary psych conference, we all get that. We all agree on that. Then we go ahead and we disagree on all kinds of other stuff because we're scientists and that's what we do. But it's just, we're kind of like at a different starting point as an intellectual community that way. And it's really been fascinating to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so about the PsychTable again. When we have all the adaptations that we are able to find and the PsychTable is fully organized, would the adaptations cluster around certain categories of adaptations?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think like when you look at the way a textbook in psychology, in evolutionary psychology, is organized, you tend to see it definitely organizes around clusters. So I think that it's going to pan out that there's definitely going to be like mating specific adaptations. There's definitely going to be emotion specific adaptations. There will be a lot of adaptations that follow from the fact that reciprocal altruism is a basic feature of who we are. Cosminis and Tooby talk about cheater detection as a basic aspect of our psychology. That adaptation can be thought of as following from reciprocal altruism. So I do feel like there's definitely going to be a lot of themes, and I'm very excited to see how Dan and our other colleagues on, connected with the project put that together and to see what follows from it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just one last question, and this one will be twofold. The first part of the question is if you think that psychology, and particularly evolutionary psychology as we have it nowadays, should be considered a branch of biology. And the second part of the question is if you think that evolutionary psychology provides us with a framework that in the future could really allow for us to unify all the several different branches of psychology.
Oh, I definitely have. I've thought about these things quite a bit. I appreciate how you've articulated them. So, is psychology a branch of biology? 100% yes. And I couldn't imagine someone really making a case otherwise. Now, it's a special branch of biology, and of course, it's not considered typically a branch of biology. But behavior is a quality of organisms. Behavior evolved for a reason. Behavior initially evolved because nervous systems led to animals with nervous systems that were able to behave and interact in real time with the environment. What a great adaptation. So the fact that you're in Portugal right now and that I'm in upstate New York right now and that we're interacting in real time right now, this is without a nervous system, the human nervous system allowed for this to happen. So I had a conversation with Robert Trivers a couple weeks ago. I was very fortunate to have this conversation with him, and I asked him, I said, is there anything special about behavior when you think about natural selection? He didn't even blink. He said, absolutely not. He said, behavior, there's nothing special about behavior when it comes to natural selection. So I think that's kind of related to this idea of whether psychology or the behavioral sciences really are part of the life sciences in general, and I would definitely say absolutely. To that second question, the second question is whether we're ever going to see a day where evolution serves as what we might call a meta theory or a unifying framework for the entirety of the behavioral sciences. Gosh, I hope so. I really hope so, man. As you probably know, the idea of evolutionary psychology is hated by some people. It is controversial. People don't like the idea that we're similar to animals. People don't like the idea that our genes affect our behavior. People don't like the idea that males and females might be different naturally in any ways whatsoever. And so these are really political hurdles, intellectual hurdles that I think have kind of worked to the detriment of advancing our understanding. I know my students and I work tirelessly to produce research that is trying to look at lots of different areas of human behavior and psychology using the evolutionary framework, and there's lots of labs all around the world that are doing that. So it's almost like a tale of two psychologies in some sense. And I think working toward integration is a really noble goal, and I think a lot of us are moving toward it. But I think the future is really it's a little bit up in the air right now. So I see.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, when you refer to the fact that some people hate or don't like evolutionary psychology, I mean, particularly if they work as scientists, then they get themselves into a very difficult position there because, I mean, if they don't like evolutionary theory applied to human behavior or to explain how the human mind works, then they would have to appeal to some sort of supernatural thing there, right?
Absolutely. The phrase that David Bloss, I mean, David Bloss is such a star in the field and such an amazing communicator. And I'll never forget, we were having beers at the Gilded Otter right here in New Paltz when he visited several years ago. And he said, there are some people who think that evolution stops at the neck. And I'm like, that is such a vivid way to sort of characterize what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Geher, just before we go, apart from the things that I've already referred to in the introduction and for which I will be leaving links in the description box of the interview, are there any other online sources that you would like to make reference to?
Well, I've written quite a lot about some of the basic ideas of evolutionary psychology in my blog. So I think if people did check out Darwin's Subterranean World and at Psych Today, I think that would be useful. And I will say that I have another book coming out, co-written with Nicole Wedberg, a former grad student of mine. It is called Positive Evolutionary Psychology, Darwin's Guide for Living a Richer Life. And in this book, we sort of try to connect the field of evolutionary psychology with the field of positive psychology, which has the goal of sort of making human lives better and facilitating people to thrive and to be their best as individuals and communities. And I have felt in my career that evolutionary psychology has so much to say on those points, that we've put together a whole book that's coming out soon, which is designed to shed light on that. So I'm hoping that people can really see the bright side of evolutionary psychology with that, and I'd suggest that people might check for that book coming out soon.
Mm-hmm. And do you already know when it will be out?
That book should be coming out in this summer, upcoming.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Geher, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show and to talk to you. It was a very interesting conversation, and I didn't really know that you had a new book about to come out, but perhaps by then when it's out, we could do another conversation if you would like so.
100%, man. I will be here. Well, thank you so much for having me, Ricardo. I appreciate it.
Hi there, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started my channel last year and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, or alternatively you can also do it on PayPal or Subscribestar. I will leave all the links in the description box. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, and my first producer, Izar Webb. Thank you for